after chasing my tail video, it's probably become obvious to you, and luckily to me as well, that a major overhaul and rethinking of my life is necessary. So here we are, with the help of the Pareto Principle, trying to revisit our lives and projects in the next 6 videos. We'll take the Pareto Principle through the basic motions of a project and then narrow it down to my sorry life. Oh, you disagree, eternal optimist? I do. I disagree, says my eternal optimist. There's plenty of light in my life. We'll explore the Pareto Principle and its advantages in one video, with a quick detour into estimating our activities mindfully. Then we'll play devil's advocate in another video. Okay, let's cut to the chase. The Pareto Principle states that 20% of your efforts yield 80% of the results. Sort of counterintuitive. Only 20% efforts produce 80% of the results? The Pareto Principle can be illustrated with a curve, not as pretty as Van Gogh's curlicues and whirls, but there it is. Why does reality appear to follow a Pareto distribution? Off the top of my head, it is somehow connected to the normal distribution in action in the real world. About everything in nature can be seen through the lens of a normal distribution curve. You see, the majority of values in nature, be it the average height, the number of hairs on our heads, you name it, are revolving around an average value. Well, except for my artist, who only possesses 3 proud hair strands on their head. But then I guess it's fitting for the artist to be an exception, since she will be playing devil's advocate against the Pareto Principle 2 videos from now. Now, let's focus on projects in this video and how the Pareto Principle is at play here. We'll speak about people, processes, and product. Lots of P's in this video. Okay, our first focus, people. The human factor, the most difficult to figure out, duh. So let's take the stakeholder engagement angle. Let's translate the Pareto Principle towards the stakeholder engagement angle. So 20% of our efforts will yield 80% of the results, which means 20% of the stakeholders would influence 80% of the project's outcomes and success. This sounds about right if we think about the power influence grid. So if the Pareto Principle applies, and it does, I've seen it on multiple projects, why not invest 1 hour, or maybe more, as a team and go through a stakeholder analysis, determining who are those 20% of the key stakeholders who, through their contribution, will help produce 80% of the results. We should probably do an assessment of stakeholders, stakeholders, to limit those who are over-involved compared to the need of the project. Then we should also continuously work to enhance and increase involvement of stakeholders who need to be more involved in the processes. Okay, regarding people, there is another important aspect, communication. So again, according to the Pareto Principle, 20% of our efforts in communication would yield 80% of the results. Now, how do we estimate communication efficiency? In this regard, Cockburn's model comes to our rescue. It talks about interactivity versus information density. You can see on this model that paper is less efficient than email. Then above that, we have more interactivity and more information density in an audio recording, yet more in a video conferencing, yet more interactivity and information density in instant messaging. Then above that is the phone, and the best of all is face-to-face communication. Of course, we cannot use all of these. We have to find the one which is optimal, depending on the type of teams and the type of projects that we're working in. Distributed teams, for example, do not allow for face-to-face communication on a daily basis. However, we can use channels which give 80% results using 20% efforts. If email is not as efficient as instant messaging on your project, then use instant messaging. If face-to-face can be maximized, it will always be a win-win situation. I will later make a video on tacit versus explicit knowledge. Okay, here's another angle, the team. 20% of your team is responsible for 80% of the results of a sprint, of an increment of value. However, a caveat here. If you are in a high-performing team, it is a different set of 20% of your teammates contributing towards 80% of the results every sprint or every phase of the project. They rotate. Now, regarding teammates on the people aspect, 20% of your teammates are influencing 80% of the team spirit, positive attitude, team accountability. Another aspect of people is investigation and learning. 20% of the investigation and learning produces 80% of the knowledge. So be smart about the 20% of the tools you will pick up to learn. It will give you 80% benefits. Another one, 20% of your teammates produce 80% of the ideas. Yet another one, 20% of your teammates drive 80% of your innovation initiatives. Don't lose these people. And another really important one, 20% of the decisions and strategies will most likely produce 80% of the results, roughly speaking. So you get the gist of it. Now let's link decisions and strategies coming from the human factor, from people, to processes now. Now regarding processes, if 20% of your strategies are bringing 80% of your project results, you can consider making those specific strategies your priority. To make it easier, let's analyze processes, breaking down the project into phases, which you can see behind me. The initiating phase, the planning phase, the executing phase, the monitoring and controlling phase, and the closing phase. So what do we do during the initiating phase of a project? We define strategies and project objectives, taking the Pareto Principle into account, hopefully. We create a benefits management plan. We work on a cost-benefit analysis, and we take into account the fact that 80% of the opportunities are created by 20% of the strategies. Now onto the planning phase. The Pareto Principle definitely at work here. 20% of planning, good planning, generates 80% of a project's success. In general, planning will take less than 20% of a project. A sprint planning way less than 20% in terms of the team's time, yet it will produce 80% of the results. If it's a smart planning, taking into account important details and priorities which make the difference, those 20% which produce 80% of the results, then the executing stage of your project or the implementation in your sprint will be effort well invested. Effective 80-20 thinkers are masters at prioritizing. Moving on to the executing phase of a project. 80% of project value is achieved with the first 20% of effort. Think the agile value time curve. The last 20% of the work takes 80% of the time. You won't cut off work that is important to round up your features. However, you can safely cut off the remaining nice-to-have stories and pieces that don't contribute much. Another aspect here, procurement, which is part of the executing phase. 80% of the inventory comes from 20% of the suppliers. Moving on to the monitoring and controlling phase of a project. 20% of the data gives 80% of value as an input for optimizing processes. 80% of budget overruns are caused by 20% of expenses. And the closing phase, finally. Take into account the Pareto Principle. Think stakeholders again here. The few 20% most influential stakeholders on that power interest grid will influence 80% of the outcomes and the acceptance of your deliverables. Think power interest grid again. 80% of projects get completed in the last 20% of the time before a deadline. 20% of my project feature story, the first 10% and the last 10%, will consume 80% of my attention. Now, let's keep in mind processes while running through the project life cycle, which is a bit more general than project phases. So it would be feasibility, design, build, test, deploy, and close. In terms of the feasibility, take into account the Pareto Principle, which means act less, less is more. Action drives out thought, and it's the thought that directs meaningful action, a wise person said. In terms of the design, take into account the Pareto Principle. 80% of the product success comes from 20% of your design ideas. The build. At the risk of repeating myself here, take into account the Pareto Principle. Testing. Take into account the Pareto Principle. Deploy. Ditto. And the closing part of the project lifecycle. Take into account the Pareto Principle. I sound like a broken record at this point. Here's a good way to tackle this. Perform a value stream mapping exercise to determine which activities within the life cycle of a product or a project bring value and which ones do not. So we spoke about people, processes, and now let's talk about product. So in terms of the product, 20% of the product features attract 80% of the customers. 20% of the cost of quality produces 80% of the quality of the product. 20% of the features address 80% of the product ergonomics, safety, and so on. 20% of a company's products or services produce 80% of the sales. And here's a good one. 20% of what an organization does creates the image of said organization. The 20% represent 80% of the value perceived by the customers. And along the same theme, it happens to people. 20% of our idiosyncrasies and peculiarities and 20% of our behavior basically drives and influences 80% of the overall impression we make on people. So I asked myself skeptically and quite desperately at this point, trying to find arguments against this Pareto Principle. Does 20% of the product market price cover 80% of the manufacturing cost? Actually, it turns out it's even less. What percentage of a product's price is its manufacturing cost, actual cost of manufacturing? Google says a good guess would be 12%. It varies all over the place. So, in conclusion, the Pareto Principle might apply in a different ratio in your specific context. It might be 20-80 or 10-90 or 25-75, but it does seem to apply for product, processes, and people. Did we cut to the chase? So, in this video, we tried to cut to the chase using the Pareto Principle in terms of people, processes, and product. Instead of dogs chasing, like in the last video, the phrase cut to the chase alludes to cars chasing. The idiom cut to the chase originated in the American film industry when many early movies ended in a chase scene. So obviously, everyone wanted to cut to the chase, to the most exciting part of the movie. The first printed reference to cut to the chase comes from script direction from the 1929 Hollywood girl. Cut to the chase. Hope this video cut to the chase. Please leave some comments below to discuss this further. Efficient project management is a very wide topic. In the next video, we'll be touching upon estimations. How do we estimate mindfully? Why do we need to estimate? In order to decide on the 20% effort that will yield 80% of the results, we need to first be able to see the big picture of the total effort involved.